Hey everyone, take a deep breath, because what we're stepping into today isn't just another news breakdown or a recycled headline you've heard 1,000 times already. This is the moment we look past the speeches, the slogans, the battlefield maps and flashy talking points, and confront the truth of what's really happening in Ukraine, a war that's reshaping the entire world order right under our noses. While politicians tweet from comfortable offices and media pundits cheerlead from studios, real armies are bleeding, economies are reeling, and the balance of global power is quietly but decisively shifting. Victory speeches in the West get shorter, excuses get longer, and suddenly even those who claimed they'd stand with Kyiv forever are whispering a different tune. So tonight, let's wipe away the propaganda fog and follow the hard facts, the battlefield realities, the geopolitical consequences, and the uncomfortable truth Washington never wanted you to hear. Ukraine has already lost. NATO has already been defeated on the ground. And Russia, whether you like it or not, is about to redraw the strategic map of Europe. If you're ready to understand why the 11th hour has arrived, if you want to know how we got here and what comes next, then stay with me. Let's begin. It is the 11th hour of the NATO-Russia war in Ukraine. Not quite midnight, but close enough that you can already see how this ends. No matter how many talking points Western politicians and their pet media manufacture to pretend otherwise, from a strictly military professional point of view, NATO lost this conflict in 2023 when the much-hyped Ukrainian counteroffensive failed to even breach the first Russian defensive line. That operation was marketed as the great turning point, the moment when Western tanks, money, and game-changing weapons would roll back Russian forces. Instead, it exposed the brutal reality that the Ukrainian army, even when pumped full of NATO equipment, could not break layered Russian defenses, could not suppress Russian artillery, and could not overcome Russian ISR and electronic warfare. Since then, what we've been watching is not an open contest, but the slow, methodical collapse of a proxy that the West has used as its battering ram against Russia, the most useful proxy Europe has had since Hitler unified the continent for his own doomed crusade against Moscow. The only real open question now is not whether Ukraine wins, it won't, but how this ends. Through outright military collapse along the front lines, or through a political settlement hammered out under American pressure in a way that allows Washington and its allies to pretend they salvaged something from this debacle. You see the desperation in the flurry of so-called plans, 28-point proposals, 19-point versions, 22-point rewrites, quick meetings in Florida between American envoys, Republican hawks, and whatever is left of the Ukrainian political class that hasn't fled or been arrested for corruption. These gatherings are not peace talks in any serious sense. They are attempts to script a narrative that makes it look as if Washington and a future U.S. administration can shape the outcome. They can't. Russia holds the initiative on the battlefield, and in a war of attrition, the side with the industrial base, manpower reserves, and defensive depth prevails. Moscow's position has been clear for years and hasn't changed, no matter how many point plans Western spin doctors shuffle around. The 4 new regions integrated into the Russian Federation, Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, Kherson, are constitutionally Russian territory, not bargaining chips. Ukrainian forces must withdraw from any remaining occupied areas there. A genuine buffer zone will be carved out, one way or another, to push NATO's direct threat further from Russia's heartland. Ukraine will not be allowed into NATO, and NATO infrastructure will not be allowed to sit on Ukrainian soil under any euphemistic cover like European stabilization forces. And in the background, a larger but rarely admitted objective remains: the demilitarization of NATO's European wing and the rollback of NATO's forward infrastructure to something close to its 1,997 lines. As set out bluntly by Moscow in late 2021, the fact that Western media pretends this demand vanished is irrelevant. For Russian planners, it never went away. Territory is just one layer. Take the question of Odessa and access to the Black Sea. Of course, Russia can take Odessa if it decides that's necessary. Anyone serious about military matters understands that. But people who think this alone determines security in the Black Sea are missing the larger picture. We've already seen Ukrainian attacks on shipping and infrastructure, including strikes on tankers carrying Kazakh oil to Chinese buyers, using sea drones and long-range systems that only function because NATO provides intelligence, logistics, and technology. Those attacks are terrorism in maritime form, and they do not depend solely on Ukraine having a particular coastline. As long as NATO states Romania, Bulgaria, and others are willing platforms, sabotage and piracy can be launched from their ports, dressed up as Ukrainian operations. Britain, in particular, has been central in supplying and guiding these surface drones, and Russia has been hitting their assembly and storage sites, but as in any modern war, some operations will get through. Even if Odessa becomes a Russian city again, the danger to commercial shipping will not magically disappear, because the problem is not geography. The problem is an alliance willing to turn global trade routes into a permanent battlefield. That is why the real strategic issue is not just Ukraine, it is NATO itself and the need to strip it of the ability to wage perpetual hybrid war on Russia's periphery. This is precisely why fantasies in London and Paris about sending European forces into Ukraine as some post-war guarantee are so delusional and dangerous. Strip away the nuclear arsenal, and you see what those armies really are. Small expeditionary forces built for colonial policing and symbolic flag waving, not for high-intensity peer warfare against a state like Russia. Put a French or British brigade into Ukraine outside any NATO umbrella, and they will simply be hunted down and destroyed. Russia has one of the world's most effective ISR systems, satellites, drones, electronic intercepts, second only to the United States in sheer volume, and it couples that with dense human intelligence networks among Russian-speaking populations in Ukraine and beyond. Any Western troop concentrations, supply hubs, or command centers would be tracked, targeted, and hit with standoff weapons long before they could hope to matter tactically. The notion that this would somehow reassure anyone, rather than trigger a wider catastrophe, shows how detached Western elites are from military reality. This is not about rational security policy. It's about a deep, centuries-old visceral hatred of Russia within certain British and European ruling circles. A hatred that predates Putin, predates the Soviet Union, and goes back at least to the Crimean War. In the mid-19th century, there was already a cultivated anti-Russian hysteria in the British elite, fueled by business interests threatened by Russian trade and influence. The destruction of the Russian fleet at Sinope became the pretext. The real motivation was to cripple a rising competitor. That mentality never fully disappeared. The same class that once used the Russian threat to protect its markets now uses it to protect its crumbling hegemony. And yet, there has always been a stark distinction between those elites and ordinary people. When Yuri Gagarin toured Britain, he was embraced with genuine warmth by workers and citizens who felt no animosity toward Russians. When Soviet football teams came to play, they drew crowds and admiration. The hostility lies not in the streets, but in the salons of those whose wealth and status are tied to imperial arrangements. These are the people who cheered every escalation in Ukraine, who wrapped regime change wars in rainbow flags and humanitarian rhetoric, and who still imagine they can throw other people's sons into the meat grinder while remaining morally spotless. Today, the political language of left and right is collapsing under the strain of that hypocrisy. The loudest voices demanding more war in Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, Syria are often self-styled liberals and progressives, while many of the clearest calls to stop these wars come from retired colonels, dissident conservatives, and independent journalists smeared as extremists. The real divide is no longer left versus right. It is truth versus managed narrative, peace versus permanent war. Look at what has happened to the image of Zelensky. For years, he was marketed as a Churchillian hero in a t-shirt. But once you strip away the PR, what you see is a man sitting atop one of the most corrupt systems in Europe, a system that was already notorious in the Pandora Papers before the war, and then received a historic torrent of money with almost no serious oversight. Western taxpayers were told their billions were going to defend democracy. In practice, huge sums vanished into offshore accounts, real estate, and the pockets of insiders. The wider public has started to notice whenever ordinary people are asked straight questions, should Zelensky be investigated for corruption? For example, the answer is overwhelmingly yes. Poll after poll outside the curated bubble of legacy media shows the same pattern. Overwhelming suspicion that this regime has looted the war effort, and deep anger that while ordinary Europeans struggle to pay heating and grocery bills, fortunes are being siphoned off under the cover of aid to Ukraine. The only spaces where Zelensky still gets near majority support are platforms saturated with Western government-funded bots and NGO echo chambers. Everywhere else, the mask is slipping. The economic dimension goes far beyond Ukraine's own corruption. The West seized, or froze, hundreds of billions of Russia's sovereign reserves as a political weapon. That move shredded the illusion that Western financial systems are neutral custodians of global capital. If a G20 country's reserves can simply be confiscated because Washington and Brussels dislike its foreign policy, then no reserve is safe. Worse, there is a growing suspicion that much of that Russian money is not sitting untouched in some vault, but has already been quietly redirected, laundered through Kiev and various Western programs, and spent. That would help explain the frantic tone in European capitals. If it ever becomes undeniable that those reserves have been effectively stolen and blown, Europe's claim to be a trustworthy financial center will collapse, not just morally, but structurally. Investors and states will draw the obvious conclusion and move their wealth elsewhere. In that sense, the theft of Russian reserves is not just a crime against one country. It is a self-inflicted wound on the entire Western financial order. All of this is embedded in a broader pattern of imperial overreach that extends far beyond Ukraine. Take Venezuela. Washington is toying with the idea of launching a war there under the flimsiest imaginable pretext, fighting drugs, even as it pardons actual narco-dictators who were convicted of shipping hundreds of tons of cocaine. Everyone with half a brain can see that the real target is Venezuelan oil, gold, and strategic autonomy, not cocaine. The Venezuelan people are armed, politically literate, and deeply patriotic. They did not overthrow Spanish colonialism and pursue the Bolivarian project just to hand their country over to a new Yankee proconsul and his cronies. Any U.S. invasion there would not be a neat regime change operation. It would be a Latin American Vietnam II. 0. A guerrilla war stretching across jungles, mountains, slums, and coastlines, entangling the U.S. for years and sending body bags home. Russia, China, Iran, and others would not stand idly by while a close partner is carved up. The same blindness that led Washington and its European vassals to believe they could break Russia in Ukraine underlies this madness, a refusal to understand that the era of easy, one-sided imperial wars is over. The same coalition driving escalation in Ukraine is complicit in the ongoing genocide in Gaza, in the relentless bombing and occupation of Syria, in the constant pressure on Lebanon, in the attempts to break resistance forces that refuse to bow. The images from Gaza, children without limbs, families wiped out, a population penned into a shrinking strip of ruins, while the world is told there is a ceasefire, have not only shattered whatever was left of the West's moral authority, they have normalized a level of cruelty that then spills over into other theaters. When you can live stream mass murder with Western weapons for 2 years and face no real consequences, piracy in the Black Sea or drone terror inside Russia becomes easier to justify to yourself. But this brutality has a cost. Public support for Israel and for these wars has collapsed across much of the West. Governments respond not by changing course, but by trying to criminalize protest, smear dissent as extremism, and tighten control over speech and media. That, too, is part of the Ukraine story, because the same apparatus that censors critics of Israeli policy censors critics of NATO policy in Ukraine. Against this backdrop, Russia has acted with a clarity that Western commentators prefer to mock rather than understand. Moscow sees itself not as waging a limited border dispute, but as fighting a proxy war against an alliance that has openly declared its intention to strategically defeat Russia, encircle it, and ultimately fragment it. When Russia speaks of demilitarizing Ukraine and denazifying its politics, it is talking about dismantling a system that has fused ultranationalist militias, Nazi collaborators, and Western intelligence structures into a single anti-Russian war machine. When Russian officials speak of NATO rolling back to older lines, they are signaling that the days of accepting NATO expansion as a fact of life are over. And because Russia has now demonstrated on the battlefield that NATO's mix of technology, propaganda, and financial sanctions does not suffice to break a peer adversary, these demands can no longer be dismissed as bluff. The West's response has been to spin, to shout, to flood the zone with narratives, polls, bots, NGOs, virtue signaling, influencers, and think tank jargon. But decibels are not victory. The only thing that ultimately matters in war is what happens at the front. There. The reality is brutal but simple. Ukrainian forces are exhausted, their best units destroyed, their manpower scraped from ever deeper drafts. Supplies of Western ammunition and equipment are stretched, and in some domains artillery shells, air defense missiles, armored vehicles falling behind Russian production. Russia, after its own painful adjustments, has mobilized its economy, ramped up output, cycled units, and refined tactics. Time is on Moscow's side, not Kyiv's. Every day that the war continues on these terms tightens the strategic noose around Ukraine and erodes the credibility of its Western sponsors. So, yes, this is the 11th hour. The strategic defeat of NATO in Ukraine is already a fact, visible to any honest military professional. What remains to be determined is how far that defeat will be allowed to cascade into the political and economic domains. How much European territory and NATO infrastructure will be rolled back or neutralized. How much of the stolen Russian wealth will be exposed, written off, or quietly buried. How many of the political elites who sold this war to their populations will be held to account? And how much of the old Western-centric order will crumble as countries across the world conclude that if Russia can withstand and outlast the collective West, then so can they. Russia can end this militarily, if it chooses, or allow the process to drag on while the West convulses politically and economically. For Moscow, both paths are tolerable. For Kyiv and its patrons, both are nightmares. And that, more than any speech or spin cycle, tells you who is actually winning this war.